Yo, everybody, welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and before we get into it, I just want to share that the day that this podcast goes up is a special one. This episode is being posted on the 5th anniversary of Sketch originally launching, and with it, the 5th anniversary of Off Panel itself. I just want to say thanks to everybody, including Liana, who is the guest for today, a listener and a guest. Thanks everyone for listening and reading, and if you want to help me celebrate the big day, take a second to rate and review Off Panel on Apple Podcasts. I never ask people for doing that. I hate it when people do it in podcasts, but whatever. 5 stars only because it's the 5th anniversary. It's not the 1st, not the 2nd, not the 3rd, not the 4th. It's the 5th anniversary. And keep an eye on Twitter for a special 5th anniversary piece of merch going up soon. Liana, I have a shirt. It's a shirt. I can't wait. It's great. But on to the podcast. This week's guest is the artist of She Said Destroy and the co-writer and artist of other upcoming, maybe secret, maybe soon to not be secret projects. It's Liana Kangas. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm so excited.
You're the 5th anniversary guest. Yay!
I know earlier I was just like, suck it, everybody else. I win.
Well, we're going to get into your work and actually like how you got to where you are, like your path to comics. But I really want to start with something that's often on my mind when I think of you. How do you know everyone?
Oh my God.
It was one of the first questions I wrote down, and I was just like, I need to know, because it's like, somebody told me to, I've recounted this before on our Instagram Live, but like somebody sent me to your table. I think it was Michael Perlman, to go talk to you and just like check out your art. And then I knew who you were. And then it seemed like, I was like, everyone knows who Liana is. How does everyone is friends with Liana? What is happening? I love it.
It is my secret goal in life to trick everybody into being my friend.
I like it. Well, you're very good at it.
Yeah.
Well, I really want to start with, I was in my research. One of the things that I loved that I came across is that you were not a fan. You were a fan of comics growing up, but before that, you were a fan of fine art in your youth, which I hate to say it, not to like stereotype about children or like young people in general, but most of them are not really like into fine art. What was it you connected with in your youth about that? And like, how did that interest manifest itself in like your larger interest in art growing?
I surprisingly have a really easy answer to this question, in that I was really close with my grandpa growing up, and he was a fine art teacher. I think he got his master's in art history and teaching art at the Massachusetts College of Art.
Okay.
And growing up, I actually didn't know much about art history. So I know there's a lot of people out there in comics, or at least illustration, that are really big into art history. But I was more so just into the concept of fine art and collecting it. And essentially because my grandpa did that, and he had taught for something like 20 years, and then eventually fell out of it and got back into it later in his senior years. That's kind of what drew me to it. And then seeing like the pop culture aspect of things like Miami and things like that growing up in Florida, that it was sort of like lowbrow to me to do fine art and be in that scene. And that was something that always interested me as like an edgy type style. But then eventually I realized what a crock of shit the fine art industry is. So
sure.
I fell out of it very quickly.
I was very
into wanting to pursue.
In my youth, I was very into Transformers, so we were obviously coming from very similar places. Both fine art, different types of fine art. Well, I mean, like, so it sounds like it was kind of almost something you wanted to do because you wanted to connect with your grandfather, like to a certain degree. So
Yeah,
was there something in particular that, I mean, besides the connecting with your grandfather part, was there anything in particular that spoke to you as like an artist that kind of carried forward? Because I think it's always interesting where people come from as artists and storytellers and everything.
I really liked portraiture.
Mm-hmm.
There was actually a cycling person that was in, and I'm going to try and get this correctly because it's like a lot of information. Sorry. He was in a senior art group that would visit occasionally. So like, I think he was a snowbird that would fly down to Florida, and he did a lot of fine art portraits of people in government, I
Okay.
want to say. And so that always interested me as like a job that you just painted people, you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
portraits always spoke to me, like, especially, vintage ones where they're just sitting there staring at you, kind of like that low key creepy aspect as an art form, just because you kind of wonder like what kind of story was behind the entire intention of that piece, right? And why it's hanging up there to begin with. So,
Yeah, I mean that I do find that to be really interesting because it's like all the choices they make are very deliberate and they're supposed to say something about this person and they're supposed to also feel like they're alive. So it's like I don't know. There's just always a story to portraits that are it's just so different than every other type of art form in a lot of different ways.
especially nowadays that you could totally just get a photograph taken, and yet some people invest maybe thousands of dollars in an oil portrait of their family. It just seems like I don't know. Like, is it vanity? Is it, there's just all those random reasonings behind something as bizarre as that. But
I may have gotten one of my good friends who's a natural sciences artist to draw, or excuse me, do like a painting of our cats for my wife for Christmas. So I would sass those people who get the oil paintings of their family, but I kind of did that.
I just recently commissioned Josh Hickson. He's a friend of a family portrait of us and our dogs. And it's very like gothic plot style.
Oh my God, that's incredible.
Like, it just was like, paint us like one of your plot girls. So I understand. I totally understand. Dogs had to be in there.
See, that would be an incredible like art cred test. You know how like there's that Project Art Cred Twitter where they're like, okay, here's like 30 different artists did a different script, but it's like now we can get them to do a family portrait of Liana's family. You got the Josh Hickson route, you got the Tyler Boss route, you got the everybody. I mean, I think that'd be hilarious.
I'm just gonna troll him and just buy a new one every year.
Oh my God, that'd be incredible. And then somebody will like go through your stuff like long after this, after you've passed away, and they're like, this woman has 80 portraits of her family. What is going on here?
Oh my gosh. Oh.
Okay, so I did want to talk. We talked about this a little bit before. We talked about your time in a comic shop, Famous Faces and Funnies, back when you were in Florida. And I find you apparently worked for, and this is what you said, for back issues in high school.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. How did that experience affect you? Like, was that, because it seems like you have a lot of empathy for comic shops and what they're going through, especially like you were really pushing at the beginning of the pandemic, working with Vita Ayala and Leah Williams to try to support comic shops in any way you could. Is that something that has really affected you going forward?
Oh, yeah, of course. So Rick Shea, the owner of Famous Faces, I think it was owned by a different person at the time, and I might get this wrong, but he had bought it out. And during that time, he found just an unnecessary amount of long boxes. And, comic shops can only afford to hire so many people. And I was spending a lot of my free time there just hanging out and, bullshitting with everybody. I think there were only 2 employees actually at the time. And there was actually 3 of us, I want to say, that would work for back issues. One guy would come every Sunday. He's a close friend of mine, Sean, that worked there for years. And he was one of the ones that I actually really wanted to go in every Sunday and spend time with and like hang out. And so we did my comic shop and like just listed stuff. And typically Rick would pay me in back issues, which I was like more than happy with, right? Like, because I really just wanted to go hang out and like feel like I was a part of the crew. And having all of that experience and then working cons with him before, transferring over to working at the Labyrinth back in the Greater Toronto area, made me realize, like it's important to cultivate a welcoming space for other readers. Because Rick had done that for me. It was nice to like be in a position to where I could do that for other people that maybe weren't as versed in comics in general. So make them feel welcome, make them feel like their choices weren't, strange or anything like that. talk to them about it, build a community. So yeah, it definitely translates to being really important, I think, especially right now with the pandemic and where comic shops are at. I mean, I've been trying to buy from most shops that I know, like Challengers, and still buying at mine here. So just making sure that like anything I buy is through a local shop and not,
Amazon.
So, yeah, exactly.
So, were you organizing those back issues? Was that what was going on? Was like, it was just...
So we would organize and list them on my comic shop and sell them to them to get credit. And then anybody that was requesting a back issue, I think Rick used that credit in order to buy. So essentially swapping, kind of.
Okay.
Anything that duplicates. So I actually got an entire run, except 6 issues of the Robin run.
The 90s one?
Mm-hmm.
Chuck Dixon and Tom Grummett?
Yeah, I didn't want to bring that up, but yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
It's a really good run. I mean,
it is, I know.
That's the sad thing. It's like you don't want to talk about them, but at the same time, it was like both that and Nightwing were like so fun in the 90s. I loved it.
I'm only missing 6 issues from that run, which is insane.
You should send me those. I have that run, and I can send you the remainder if you'd like.
What?
Yeah, I think I have most of it, and I don't really care about having a complete run, so let me know. Well, I also think it's interesting, too, because it seems like, the Labyrinth, or it was Labyrinth, right? Was that yeah. So, like, you were in Toronto, which is the greater Toronto area, which is, like, one of, like, maybe one of the more underrated, like, metropolises for comic creators. Like, I think people sleep on how big of a deal it is. But also, when you were at, like, Famous Faces and Funnies, I know that you had told me before that you had met Maury Hollowell, who was, like, a big influence for you. Like, he's a Marvel colorist, did Civil War, a number of other things. How important was kind of, I mean, you talked about it already, like, kind of cultivating that community and, like, meeting people that can help kind of guide you as you're trying to figure all this stuff out?
Apparently really important. I didn't think about that until just now. Maury's like, he was so kind, and him and Carl, oh shoot, he did Buffy.
Carl Moline?
Yes, Moline, yeah. He would often come to our shop as well for signings and stuff like that, and it was always nice to ask advice. And Maury and I stayed in touch, I think, over the years. I mean, pre me moving to Toronto, and just kind of kept in touch online. But in terms of shaping my career, there's always been people that I've asked along the way. Like Lan Pitts is from Melbourne as well, or at least he was there for a really long period of time. And when I had started pursuing, I reached out to him, remembering that he had done a lot of reviewing for like comicbook.com, and he even started writing for the WWE comics. So anyone that I felt vaguely comfortable with, I've probably asked advice from, to be honest. Anyone that's done more than me, I've never hindered myself from reaching out, because worst they could say is no, right?
Right, exactly. I think people get a little fearful of that. I mean, it's like sometimes people ask me, like, how do you book the guests that you book on your podcast, or how do you talk to the people you do? And I'm like, I think the greatest thing I learned early on is that, like, comic creators are just people, and that don't act like, I mean, don't put people on a pedestal, because most of them just, I mean, like any famous or semi-famous person, like, most people just want to be treated normally. Like, they don't want to be, like, treated like they're, like, some sort of superstar god or something like that.
The concept of comics famous is hilarious to me. But maybe it's because I got over the leap of, like, talking to people that I admire, Now I just, like, silently sweat over it, just...
Comics famous is a pretty funny thing. But I did want to talk about your path because, and I might be missing steps. How did you went Florida, Canada, Memphis?
Mm-hmm.
How did, like, that's ping pong.
And then back to Jersey, like near New York.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So, like, what led you on that path? I mean, like, I just think that's really interesting because, like I said, Toronto, like, if you're talking about trying to cultivate a great, like, comic community, that is just an A+ place. And Memphis, we've talked about it before, Memphis Comic Expo. I'm friends with a whole lot of that crew. It's like this place that comic creators really love to go because it just seems like such a welcoming place. Like, it seems like those, I don't know if it was intentional to go to those places and you wanted to be a comic creator, or if it just kind of worked out. But it seems like you kind of got lucky in some ways.
It totally just worked out. My husband was slated to move these places for work, actually. The Toronto one was really exciting, obviously, because he like had asked me if I wanted to go by putting Scott Pilgrim on and being like, hey, like, want to do this? And so I was just like, okay. And how I actually met most of my friends in comics that really helped me along the way was from moving to Toronto. And like, we were near this animation college called Sheridan. And there was a lot of graduates there. Like even my boss was a graduate, I think, from Sheridan. And I met Daryl Graham. He's done animating for like Space Jam and a ton of movies and like some Netflix stuff. But he's actually one of the biggest inspirations that like kind of pushed me into being like, why haven't you just done it? Right.
Right.
Like, I want to do this, but like, okay, why don't you just sit down and do it? So he was like a really big inspiration. And same with my boss, actually. He really was like, because at the time, I actually wanted to open a comic shop when we were moving back to Memphis, back to the States.
That's me too. That's
really?
Like, yeah, because everyone, a lot of times people are like, oh, so do you want to make comics? Like, is that why you write about them and talk about them? I'm like, no, I do not want to make comics. I'd be bad at it. And also, I just have never been interested. But I've always wanted to open a comic shop, so I'm with you. I think you and I are like the two people.
Right. It's like cultivating a network of like really cool people to just talk about comics and like sell them comics all day. Why wouldn't you want to do that, right?
Sounds fun.
But and my boss was like, don't do it. It's a trap, you know, which hilariously, like, I get it. He was a great guy, but I realized, so comics and collectibles here in Memphis, they would be a huge competition, and I would never want to compete against them because they're amazing. Ron and Donnie have had the shop, I think, for over 20 years. So just seems like, you know, and now they're, you know, kind of friends and great and really good to me, host me a signing anytime I want. Like,
that's awesome.
But so, yeah, turns out the first time we lived in Memphis was a blip that wasn't supposed to happen, but it's great that it did because it led us to moving to New Jersey, creating wonderful relationships with like some of my closest friends, like Erica Schultz and like Beta Ayala in New York, through the Mine anthology. And then by the time I had really invested in those friendships, it was like, oh, we got to leave again.
Yeah.
So it was kind of very sad, but at the same time, such strong relationships that they carry out through. And, you know, Memphis is great. I mean, we said yes because we knew it was going to be great coming back. And Donnie throws, what has been called the Comics Camp this past year that I've heard, the Comic Expo or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But all the creators were like, it's like camp, but better. Totally agree with that.
I love it. Well, you mentioned anthologies, and I think it's interesting that it seemed like you largely started with anthologies. And I think that, you know, I remember talking to somebody, I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was James Wright, and we were talking about how he had this experience where he went up to Steve Lieber, and he was talking to him about how he was like working on this gigantic story, and it was like, I think it was like a 100-page or like some gigantic comic that he was going to do. And Steve gave him the advice of, like, you should start smaller. It's like walk before you run. Like, don't do your magnum opus from the start. You want to prove you can do 2 pages and prove you can do 4 pages and etc. Did you find that working on anthologies before you did like She Said Destroy, before you moved into other larger projects, really helped you prep for like what that world was going to be like?
Yes and no. I think by the time I ended up starting to do like what's considered like monthlies, I still feel like I'm not entirely sure I have a footing even to this day.
Yeah.
But it's just because the industry is so structured, right? Like some publishers want to have a couple in the can before, you know, going to print, or some are like, all right, let's do it right now, and like pray for the deadline best, you know? But I do think anthologies have taught me a lot about how to collaborate better with people and how I can be a better collaborator in general. Um, and I think it's just given me a sense of like more sense of community than what monthlies give me. So
Right.
I value that a lot.
Yeah. I mean, if you're just working with like Joe on She Said Destroy for like 5 issues, it's, you know, you don't get to see a huge part of the world. You get to learn about a lot of the intricacies about, you know, specific things. But if you work with Vita and if you work with, I'm trying to remember, who was your collaborator on the 2000 AD book? Lisa.
So Katie Rex, and
Oh,
then
Katie Rex. That's it.
another one was Erica Schultz.
Erica Schultz. Yeah. I mean, you kind of, I don't know. I mean, you're learning a lot about all the different ways that people operate and how you can work. It seems like there's like advantages and disadvantages to both in terms of like learning how to make comics.
Yeah. Almost kind of like whiplash constantly. But I kind of like it, right? Like being on your toes 24/7, even with this pandemic, I feel like things have started to calm down and I'm in a state of what's going wrong. Like, because I'm not doing 8 things at once right now. So
Yeah. Yeah. You do seem like you keep yourself busy.
way too busy. Yeah. Oh, a lot of my friends grill me for it.
Well, I mean, you know, I think it's interesting because like some people, God, who was I talking to? Like I was talking to somebody recently who makes comics, and they were talking about how they can really only focus on like one project at a time. And then when I had Bendis on, he was like, I asked him about this one quote he had one time where he was like, oh, I like to have like 6 projects going basically at all times because you never know when inspiration's going to hit. It's like one day it's like a Legion of Superheroes day, and then another day it's like a Superman day, and it's just because that's when it hits. You can't really control it. And I do think that's interesting. I mean, it's like, that's the funny thing about, like, you think about creativity and you think about creating comics and everything like that, but so much of it is like, it's creativity, but it's also just like how humans work, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, as long as from my experience with doing pitches with a whole bunch of friends recently, or agreeing to do a pitch and we're all at different stages, if a writer typically is fine with me working on it at a leisurely pace, or like whenever I have time for it, it's worked out great because I have 6 pitches, you know, and some are only at the character design stage and some, you know, I'm almost an issue through. So as long as my collaborators are totally fine with it, I've gotten to the point where I've worked on, you know, way too many at once.
Oh man. Well,
I don't want to write a number in that.
I mean, it is funny. It's like that only becomes a problem if they all become approved simultaneously. Then you're going to need like time traveler or clones or something. I don't know what.
My actual nightmare. Yeah.
It's like one of those good problems to have that you kind of also hope doesn't become a problem.
Yeah.
Well, so you said yes and no with She Said Destroy in terms of how or the anthologies and how it prepped you. I guess with She Said Destroy, what did that teach you about, like, what were the differences there versus the anthology? Was it just maintain schedules and deadlines or collaboration, or what was it?
Both. I moved across country.
Oh,
so
boy. Yeah.
that was my number one problem and totally my fault. And they were actually pretty flexible with it. It not only, really was the first time that I've worked with a publisher to where they were really hands-on. Black Mask was fairly hands-off. So it was kind of nice having, I don't want to say the word bosses, but I miss having an environment where you have people to constantly bounce things back and forth onto. And Vita always was like that with Black AF, which was amazing. And so was Sarah. But She Said Destroy, it was great because everyone seemed very involved and very excited about the project. So it was nice to kind of like be on it every day and know that there was like an accountability factor, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think I'm explaining that correctly and how I feel. Like,
well, I mean, it's kind of like if you're just working, like sometimes comic creation can be kind of mercenary. If you just get on a project and you're like, oh, just do this work and then like turn in the pages and et cetera, it kind of lacks the emotional connection. But I think the interesting thing about She Said Destroy is that Vault, seemingly in your experience, I don't know if it's the same for everyone, almost it felt like as an outsider, like you almost had like a familial experience there, and it's like you almost kind of owed, Damien and Adrian and Tim and Joe, it's like you felt like you owed something to them. It's like you all were part of this thing that was larger than just this one book, if that makes sense. That sounds very dramatic.
No, I think you're explaining it exactly how I wanted to explain it. Thank you for like reading my mind. Exactly. They seem to invest a lot into it because they believed in it. And that's how it made it feel sort of like family. They're so good at making everybody feel like family when you work with them as a publisher. And I do think that that's very true. And the way She Said Destroy was implemented, they were very passionate about it. And, they put it on like Emerald City's banners and like all that stuff. And so it just felt like they believed in us before we even had the whole thing like on the table for them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So not to say there was a lot of pressure on that standpoint, but I put a lot of pressure on myself to try and deliver. So I think that's more so maybe the disconnect is with like anthology, like where I wasn't prepared for that. It was also my first creator owned that was being published. So
yeah. Well, and I do think that with like longer projects, it's like people can kind of connect with them on a different level than like a small story. That's not to say that there aren't small stories that people connect with. I mean, like I wrote like a 1,500 word article on like a 2-page Hellboy story in which he ate pancakes. So like I have no problem like that happens too. But at the same time, it's like, I don't know. It just kind of seems like almost the Vault team saw what She Said Destroy could be to people before you guys almost did.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, because I always love seeing it. It's just like kind of wild. Like the people who are fans of She Said Destroy are like big fans. Big fans.
I definitely agree with you on that one. And I have a lot of Patreon fans that are also now big Vault people and big, very into like fangirling Vault and stuff like that. So it makes it, cyclical for me.
Totally.
In terms of, because they've hired me to do other things like variant covers and like recently a shirt for like Vagrant Queen and stuff like that. So it feels like I'm kind of like able to like give back to the Vault community, right?
Yeah.
Which I like.
Yeah. It's always really interesting to me too, because it's like, I feel like obviously Marvel and DC has their hordes, but there's like it's almost like there's like Twitter gangs who support individual publishers and they're like, I'm a Valiant person or I'm a Vault person or whatever. And it just kind of pops up. And I always find that to be really interesting. I'm very agnostic. I like everybody.
Right. Same. And it almost seems like they would die on their sword for them, which
yes.
I love. And at the same time, that's my favorite type of fanboy, right? Like, or fangirl.
The ride or die.
Yeah, the ride or die would fall on a sword for, like, fanning over is definitely the term I would use. It's great.
Yeah. Well, so you're several projects in, you're working on, well, a lot of stuff to your right, seemingly, because you've looked over a few times. You're like, what have I done to myself?
Yeah.
I'm interested because you've been kind of, in the public's eye, you've only been doing this for a little bit. Do you feel like you have a good feel for like who you are as an artist, or is that still kind of evolving as you're working on these projects?
I actually thought about this last week. I think I'm just now coming to terms with who I am with delivering what type of art I'm giving.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's been a questionable process up to this point. Like, do I have to establish a style, and will I change it depending on this book or this cover? And will people be able to recognize that it's mine? And recently I'm just kind of like, whatever I feel for when I'm drawing that specific project is what it's going to be. And I just need to be comfortable with it and like execute it. Right. And get it done and turn it in. Obviously put 100% into it, but I think I've relaxed on worrying about whether or not it looks like a certain way,
right,
or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it seems like some people really glom on to the idea that they need like this signature style. Like if you look at this, it's like, I know this is, I don't know, looking around, Michael Lark. Okay. Like, this is Michael Lark. But then, I mean, probably my favorite artist ever is Stuart Immonen. And every single Stuart Immonen project looks different than the last. I mean, he does like his stuff with Catherine, like the independent graphic novels. And they're completely different than what you'd see on Superman's Secret Identity, which has like almost like Norman Rockwell type feel at times. And then you look at something like on Next Wave, where it's just crazy, insane energy, like all over the place, because that's what it's supposed to be. And I do think it's interesting. Like, I do think that sometimes what happens when people are kind of coming up is like you can get locked in on the idea that you need to be one thing. And I don't know if that's necessarily what it's supposed to be. I don't know. I feel weird because I'm not even a comic creator and I'm trying to talk about what comic creators are or aren't. But
no, yeah. No, I totally agree. I think it's more so with the fact that I'm in this specific area of wanting to still do licensed work and whether or not my style will affect whether or not I'm hired, I guess.
Oh, sure.
Versus like, I definitely love indie and would prefer to do indie and tell original stories. But at the same time, will that pay the bills versus getting licensed work? And will they still enjoy what I'm working on in this style? Or do I have to adapt to a different style? And other questions that I'm like constantly asking myself. It's such a like difficult path to navigate this career, like in general. And, I don't typically second guess my style, but sometimes it's like, oh, it would be fun to like experiment a little and like do something else for this book or whatever, which I kind of am doing right now. And I feel really confident about it. I've actually gotten really good, comments on like the totally different flop that I did. So
that's interesting. I like it. I'm looking forward to seeing it. Well, I do. There is one thing that I think that is very quintessentially Liana. And I feel like you got a color vibe down to the point where your upcoming project with Paul Azaceta and like Joe Carallo with TKO, that's like Paul's following your colors.
I definitely low-key was going to ask him if he was like inspired by me at all, but I don't want to sound like super full of myself, and be like,
I like that you did a little hair flop
me,
there.
Right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it does. It feels like it's like kind of matching your aesthetic to a certain degree, and not in like a way that's like aping it or anything like that, but it's like consistent. And it's interesting because when it was to the point when I saw that one panel that was tweeted, I think it was by TKO, I was like, did Liana color this?
Yeah. I'm honored that you thought that. I'm like low-key hoping that because we're kind of friends, he just like gravitated in that direction.
Yeah.
But he's also low-key a genius and probably doesn't get to color that often. So he probably just went wild on that, which is fun.
I just think it's really interesting seeing him coloring himself like that, given the fact that he's such a moody artist most of the time. And like those colors, like there's like some vivaciousness to it that I'm like, Paul Azaceta with all these purples? What's going on here? This is crazy.
I can't wait for you to see it. Oh my gosh.
Oh, okay. So I think this is a really interesting project. I literally do not know anything about it except for the people who are working on it and the fact that you're co-writing it rather than drawing or doing anything else with it. So what can you tell me about it?
So TKO, from what I believe, is putting out a printed collection. And this is I want to say 15 pages. I might be wrong on that number. So it's not quite a whole issue, but it's pretty hefty.
Yeah.
And Z reached out to me because we were actually kind of mutuals in the con circuit, and I had reached out to him, like interested in TKO in general. And one day he just asked, like, would you ever be interested in writing? And I was like, I have never thought about that as like a serious career form. Um, and like we shot the shit for a little bit, and I was like, can I ask for help if I do this? Because I would prefer to not lean on other people without giving them credit. And because Joe and I just finished an entire stint of working together for 8 months, I was like, hey, would you want to co-write something with me? So it was great. Sebastian, our editor, was like, hell yeah, do it. And it worked out great. And it's TKO. It's going to be printed in the collection and sold, I believe, on their store and also in comic shops, from what I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And might be online, but don't quote me on that.
Normally they do like the print collection that like shops can order from, and then there's also like the digital one. So is it like part of like an anthology kind of?
That's my understanding of it.
Okay. Are you able to say what it is yet? No? Let's not get you in trouble.
Well, I'm not entirely sure if it's going along with a theme, but I will say that ours is horror related.
I like it.
Sci-fi horror.
So I always find artists getting into writing to be a very interesting thing. Was there a significant learning curve there? Or do you find that, like, I don't know. I mean, like, I'm always interested in where like your kind of art brain comes in, like writing. Does the way that you think about art and the way that you think about storytelling, like, make it maybe a little bit easier on you to like write a project like this?
I would say no, only in that there were a lot of things that Joe taught me. Maybe not rule sets, but things that I hadn't really thought about in how a story can be better executed. And that might be because he's also an editor on other books. And Sebastian taught me tons as well in terms of the feedback that we got and how we shaped the story. But I constantly at the beginning went in thinking visually and trying to write it visually. And when I was able to step back after doing a whole bunch of research, which I did a ton of research for this, it was a lot easier to think of it more mechanically once I had seen some of the stuff that Paul started drawing. So I wasn't attached to it visually anymore, which was nice. And the more pages came in, the easier it was to shape with like Sebastian's direction. So editor is obviously very crucial and key, but and Joe and I worked really well together. Sometimes we just hop on a call and like hash it out right then and there.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure doesn't happen often. I'm not quite sure how other co-writers work, but it was cool because Joe kind of already flat out knew my weaknesses in writing. And so he would help kind of teach me along the way.
Mm-hmm. That seems like a pretty damn fantastic group of people to work with on your first writing project. Cause like, I love Sebastian's awesome. Sebastian's like a guy who like has like long-standing relationships with people like Garth Ennis and other writers like that. So it's just like, if you could do like a fantasy draft of editors you could learn a lot from, he would be one of like the top 5 draft picks probably. And then with Paul, I do think it's interesting. It's almost like being able to separate yourself from the visuals. Once you saw Paul's stuff kind of unlock something for you. It's like, now I can just focus on writing because I'm not thinking visually as much anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. And it made it a lot comfortable for me too, knowing him, because I could just call him and be like, hey, would you be willing to draw this? And then like, obviously being like, you can do whatever you want because you're a phenomenal storyteller without writing. So it was kind of knowing that I could lean on him in most cases. And then also knowing that I could be like, is this too much? Do you want to do this?
Yeah.
Can I reference this? So.
This is definitely another one of those cases where knowing everyone helps a lot.
Yeah, I know everybody. But Sebastian's really cool. He's like really into metal, and I didn't know that. And I am, and like kind of grew up in the metal scene. So it was kind of nice knowing that I had like a little bit of a connection with him, because I did like look up to him, right? Like he had already previously worked with Paul too. So that kind of all made it a lot easier to like slide into that role, I guess.
Has he tried to convince you to read the manga series Berserk yet?
No. Oh my God.
Are you familiar with Berserk?
Yeah, so at the Labyrinth, there was one customer that was the sole reason why we had the entire thing in stock.
Mm-hmm.
And I just was like, how many volumes are there?
There's so many.
How many?
There's
I
so
don't.
many. I've joked to Sebastian before that he's basically like, God, I'm trying to remember, like the Latter-day Saints. I'm trying to remember who's the people who go door to door to try to like talk about their religion with people. But anyways, he's like,
Latter-day Saints.
yeah, he's like that, but with Berserk.
Yeah.
And he mailed me the first 2 volumes of it to try to get me to read it. And I was like, that was really nice. And then I looked and I can't even remember how many volumes there were, but he's just so passionate about it. I will love Sebastian forever because when I had my first sketch / off panel meetup at Emerald City Comic Con last year, he was the first person that showed up to the meetup. And I was like horrified that no one was going to show up. And I was like, at least Sebastian showed up. At least Sebastian showed up. Other people showed up too, but Sebastian was the first, so I love him for it. I think that, I don't know. I mean, how does it feel getting into writing? Like, is it something that you are enjoying? Is it something you could see yourself doing more of, or is it just something that like was an opportunity that popped up, but you're mostly focused on art?
I am grateful for the experience, and I do want to put it towards, I would love to do shorts like that. I'm not entirely sure I would want to do serialized comics or monthlies, but I would like to apply like what I'm learning to a graphic novel at some point.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting because it seems like in some ways kind of having experience in other roles can help with being able to make comics overall. It's like if you know like what a writer goes through and if you know what an artist goes through and a colorist and et cetera, it kind of, the idea is that knowing the mechanics of all that and what goes into it can help you in your individual role. I don't know. I'll be interested to see how that kind of pays forward for you because I've heard that can be helpful. I don't know.
Me too. Yeah. I'd rather have a toolbox than no tools at all, right?
Yeah.
Like even just, lower level tools and being able to empathize with a writer for what they have to experience in our relationship. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I will be more sensitive, that's for sure, in terms of like what I ask from somebody in the future.
Well,
so.
and now you're very uniquely gifted to be able to answer the writer-artist debate next time it comes up on Twitter because it always comes up. Oh my God. We didn't talk about the James Stokoe comic. That's like the best.
That is the funniest comic I've read in years.
It's so incredible. I think I'd read it before, but seeing it again for the first time in a few years, it was just like, for listeners that don't know, go on James Stokoe's account, find this comic he did that was basically a like 4-image or or screen like walkthrough on the writer artist debate and how like these badass super hardcore, like what were they? Were they like machine people with like wheels and stuff? They roll in.
The writer-artist combo.
The writer-artist combo. It's like the hyphenates. Like that's Liana. She's coming in there with her like crazy cyborg gear. I love it.
I'm definitely riding on a motorcycle while holding a knife at the same time.
Oh, it's so good. Well, okay, so I want to switch off of like the kind of creative stuff because I want to talk about your podcast here in a second, but I want to talk about the kind of the environment we're in. You've been very active during you were very active during the early days of the pandemic to try and help shops and creators out. I already mentioned that, but also like when all this stuff with Black Lives Matter came up, you were very focused on helping in your community and doing what you can. I guess like where, I don't know, this is kind of a personal question, but where does that like hopeful spirit come from in you? Is it just something that like you want to help people when they're in need, or is it, I don't know. I got nothing. That's not even a real question. Go for it.
Are you asking me why I'm such a phenomenal human being?
That's basically it. I mean, people love you. Why are you so amazing? I mean, that's it. Amber actually asked me to ask this question.
Oh, I love her already so much. So I don't know. I grew up really, really like aggressively poor. One of the graphic novels I want to do is like a retelling kind of my childhood and like things I've had to go through. And I won't get into it, but it's poor and crazy stuff happened and things like that. And I've learned to value outside relationships outside of family, in that if you can be positive and like cultivate and input energy into friendships, much like relationships, that you will get them in return. And I love equality and like everything for everybody, right? And so moving to this city because I'm so new, when all the stuff started happening with Black Lives Matter and the protests and stuff like that, I couldn't really find anywhere to kind of volunteer or do anything with my time. And so like I tried to set aside hours, like much like during the pandemic with helping with the comic industry collective, just like, I have free time, so I should give it for other people that are going to go out of their way to like stand up for people's rights in our city and stuff like that. So everybody should feel loved. And that's, I guess, probably the easiest answer to that question. And I love everybody, like seeing as I want everybody to be my friend. It's also a bad flaw, let me tell you, because I want to be friends with everybody, but that's not always how it works out, right? And I'm also very realistic in the sense that like comics is a small, big community. And so I think it's easy for everybody to hopefully know one another,
Yeah.
And it's already a really difficult industry to get through as it is. Like if I can make it the slightest bit easier for anybody else going through and like maybe have it less difficult than I had it, then it will be worth it to me.
Yeah.
So.
You know how like when somebody finds out that you live in Memphis and you're like, oh, do you know this person? And like the answer is almost always no, because like Memphis is a big place. Anchorage, where I live, Anchorage, Alaska, is actually somehow that small, where basically if you ask somebody if they live in Anchorage, odds are you probably do know this person. It's just like, it's one of those things where it's bizarre. Like Patrick Brower at Challengers.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, I have a friend who works at this one restaurant in downtown Anchorage. Do you know her? And I was like, I didn't know her, but the next time we went to eat at that restaurant, she was our waitress and we ended up talking to her for a while. But it's really funny. But I feel like the comic industry is kind of like Anchorage in the sense that it's really big, but kind of everybody knows each other in a weird way. And so I think that's really that's one of the themes in this podcast accidentally is the fact that it seems like community and being part of it and making sure that what you came into is not, I mean, like what you leave when you're done with comics, I guess, is maybe better than what you came into. Like you're trying to help going forward. I don't know. I think that's really good because you talk to a lot of comic creators who like didn't have that when they were coming up. Like they didn't have that support from a previous generation because they viewed them as competition. It seems like you and a number of other creators that are in kind of your group are focused on kind of changing that to a certain degree. And I think that's great.
The word competition is huge because we're all human, right? And like we definitely have some sort of aspect in our lives that jealousy overcomes us, and like competition is definitely maybe the word used. But I think because the industry is like a big small town and there are so many different ways that we can make money as freelancers, I think that it's easier to let go of the competition aspect in terms of, instead of maybe being jealous of peers' successes and signing onto a book or something like that, that just would hopefully make you realize, what could I do differently in my path to do the next thing, right? And so I think it's a healthier aspect to continue, especially to make it in comics, right? Because I see a lot of people give up. And I've definitely been through stints where I didn't have any work, but it just makes me think, okay, what do I need to do next to do this next book? Or like maybe I could do something on my own and people will see that I'm working on something and that will be, inspiration for my next project that somebody will see or whatever. And creators uplifting other creators. People come to me all the time for advice for who to hire on books and like colorists, and one, the fact that they trust my judgment, that's real great. But two, like, friends help friends in the industry. And since it's such a small industry, it feels kind of like a moot point to not kind of be in good graces with everyone. I don't know, or at least be like acquainted with.
Yeah, and I think with like social media, it's so visible too. It's just I don't know. I mean, and it's so easy. It's like a person wants a retweet, you give them a retweet. You know, even things as basic as that. I don't know. I think it's really interesting. Well, the one I do want to ask though. So you always have a lot going on. You always are doing things extracurricular. I have to imagine at like certain points you kind of get burned out a little bit. Like, what do you do to combat that? Is there like a safety zone, and is it just like cuddling your labbits that are behind you? If people don't know what a labbit is, they're gonna be really confused about that statement.
I'm like, have you known me for like 10 years already? Can you see the burnout on my face? Like, it's just tattooed on there. I've been lucky in that, like, a lot of people in the industry, like, I see as friends, like, at cons and stuff like that. Like, I would be offended if we didn't meet up after, like, or whatever. Like, if I didn't go to the sketched after party, that's like a number one thing to do on my list, right? But a lot of my friends call me out for like getting to a point of burnout, and they're like, "You need to calm down." And I'm like, "Yeah, sure. But I actually step back and typically will read like an entire run of something and try to disassociate myself as like working in the industry and just like enjoy it again. And then usually like take 2 to 3 days off, and then I'm like somewhat back to normal. So
That's like your reset.
yeah, the last time I did it was I reread Wictive. It was like right after New York Comic Con last year and everything.
You say Victive?
Wictive, sorry.
Oh, Wictive.
Wicked and Divine.
I was like, what is Victive? I know what Wictive is. You know, it's funny. A lot of times, because I'm always like researching things for podcasts or doing articles and things like that, that sometimes like I just forget to read comics just to enjoy them. And it's really weird that happens. But I just had Jeff Smith on the podcast, and I love Bone. Bone is like one of my favorite comics ever. And I was rereading the 1-volume edition, which is 1,400 pages of comics. And I was like trying to get it done before I talked to him, even though like literally it had no point. Like I have like that comic basically memorized in my brain. And I finished, like I did the podcast and I was only like halfway through, and I was going to put it away. I was like, oh, there's no point in doing it. And I was like, I'm actually enjoying this. I should just finish reading this comic. But it's funny how that stuff happens where it's like, sometimes you just kind of forget to enjoy these things. It's weird.
Oh, 100%. At this point, it's just like second nature for me to pick up my pull and a couple trades and then just put it in a pile and forget about it. But now the pile's way too big to ignore. So I've gotten to the point where I can, like I'm reading through all of Invincible right now. I've never read it. And I cracked open the big hardcover of Low. And any hardcovers or trades I have, I'm trying to like burn through before going back to single issues. But it's helped a lot with burnout. And honestly, Animal Crossing could not have come out at a better time to recover from burnout. And that has been the one reason why I'm still going to this day.
I am so envious of everyone who has a Switch that is playing Animal Crossing, because it feels like you guys are in this incredible bubble of joy. And all I get from it is like that everyone's always selling turnips, and I don't understand what's going on. But I take joy out of it too, because it's like, it's so enthusiastic. People just have such a good time. Did you see when like Elijah Wood went to somebody's island?
Yes.
Oh my God, it was like the most charming thing that's ever existed. There was like this screenshot.
Talk show that there's some talk show that he was invited on in the game.
And then like T-Pain went on it, and they gave him some crown that was worth like 10,000 roses or something like that. I'm like, what the fuck does that mean? But I'm so happy it's happening.
The currency in this game, I don't understand.
Oh my God, it's incredible. I love that there's a talk show for Animal Crossing. It's perfect. Well, I want to close by talking about 2 theoretical but definitely happening projects for you, because you're not busy enough. Okay. You are creating 2 podcasts. So now you are my sworn enemy. You are now a podcaster.
We're no longer friends.
We're no longer friends. This is the end of the podcast. But one of them is a drunk history for comics, which is an absolutely spectacular idea. As soon as you mentioned this a while ago, and as soon as you said that, I was like, how does this not exist already? And the other one is like horror movies with an emphasis on women who direct or act in them or characters. Why are those things you want to do with an already pretty busy plate?
So much like we were talking about burnout, I can't hold my labbits all the time when
Sure.
I'm walking around the house. But I've actually recently been drumming a lot and learning how to drum. And there is a point to that. But I've been asking Jonathan Diener for advice, and he's a writer in comics, but he's also like huge in the music industry, and I think he used to write for a whole bunch of music stuff. But him and I were having a conversation about how my husband has been doing like podcast intros for friends of ours and things like that. He's kind of like big into music and like produces stuff for himself and for friends. But him and I were watching Drunk History one night, and I think it was the episode. I don't remember what episode it was. Who am I kidding? But I realized, like, how funny would this be if somebody told Stanley's story but drunk? I would watch that and listen to it. Also, who would be the cast for that? And then I like ran it through my brain. And then I tweeted that one tweet weeks ago and was like, who would be interested in this? This would be hilarious. Comedy Central, please don't sue me. But I had talked to a couple friends, Jono, and then a friend, Matt Emmons, who was interested in like immediately being on the first, jump to doing it. That it would be fun to have a format where we talk about like what's going on in life and like starting to drink. And then by the time like somebody's like liquored up enough, all right, tell me one history lesson in comics or, relating to comics in some sort of sense. And the other one was actually spawned by Skylar Patridge, and I actually have like wine dates.
Nice.
And her and I have been exchanging horror movie recommendations back and forth for weeks now. And I was like, every time we end up talking, we always relate back to that in some sort of sense and then go on this like huge rant about something that happened in like one of the movies or whatever. And I was like, it would be so fun if this was a podcast. I've never heard it before. And also it'd be fun to like interview. We thought that there was a really interesting intersectionality of comics and horror movies. A lot of people watch it. And so I'm like, we need to get all of our friends, this coming back to like community and friendship and whatnot. I want to know what everybody else thinks about it too. So, it's more so just me having an excuse to call people and ask them their thoughts about things. So,
you were talking about your friend and how you guys would start with one thing and then get back to like the movies and everything. I have this friend, his name is Brian, and we've always had like the most ridiculous conversations. I've always wanted to do a podcast with him because of this, but we'll start by like, I remember one time we went canoeing. We went canoeing in the middle of this glacial fed lake in Alaska, and we were being dumbasses, and we were like splashing each other with water in the middle of the water. And like, this is like this massive lake that was probably like, I don't know, we were probably like 1,500 feet from the shore. And so we flipped the canoe, and the three of it, there was two of us and there was our other friend. And like, we like went back into, we had to swim to shore and everything like that. And one of my friends, this is like a very dramatic story. One of my friends actually stopped paddling. I had to go back in and actually carry him to shore because he couldn't move anymore because it was so cold. Long story short, the next day we went to IHOP, and my friend Brian and I start by talking about that situation. And then we started relating it to the movie Signs and how like, everyone, back at that point, I was much larger than I am. I like weighed a lot more, and I was like impervious to the cold because I was larger and everything like that. And we were like, you had to be that big so you could go back and get him. Like, it was all necessary. And it was, if you listened to us, it would have been like the most high sounding conversation that's ever existed. But I do think I love those conversations where you start with one topic and then you start bridging it to everything. And it kind of sounds like, to a certain degree, like that intersectionality is what you're talking about. Trying to tap into that, like, I don't know, like ubiquitousness, like the interconnectivity of all these different stories and how they connect to our lives. I just think that stuff's awesome.
Yeah. I first of all, I'll be your first subscriber to this We Flipped the Canoe and Now We're Talking an IHOP podcast. It sounds like comedians in cars getting coffee, except like
very dire.
3 BFFs almost die and then decide to survive at IHOP.
What a weird experience.
Yeah.
So what, last question I want to ask you, what would be your drunk history that you would want to do for comics? And then what would your horror movie, if you had to pick one, what would your horror movie be? I can start with mine if you want.
Yes, please.
Naturally, drunk history would be, well, are you going to be doing it about people, or are you going to be doing it about like comics? Because I imagine like Zach Jenkins from Xavier Files drunkenly trying to talk about like Shatterstar and Longshot's relationship and like trying to explain how they're both each other's dad. And like, that would be spectacular. So
I'm pretty excited about that. I think I'm letting anyone choose whatever they want.
Okay.
As long as it somehow relates to comics in a specific way.
Mine would be Next Wave, and my horror movie, excluding, Constantine, so we can talk about Tilda Swinton, would be The Descent, because I love The Descent.
Okay.
Have you seen The Descent?
I'm into that. I want to say yes. I can't picture it in my brain right now.
It's about 6 women going, like, spelunking, like, they're going cave diving.
Oh, yes. Oh, my God. When did that come out?
Like, early 2000s?
Or
something like that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay.
That movie scares the crap out of me.
That would be a great one to go back and watch.
It's really, well, the interesting thing about it is it actually has 2 different endings. In the UK, they had an ending that was extremely dark. And then they had a US version that was also dark, but less dark.
Ooh, okay.
It's interesting.
I'm going to try and find both.
Okay, yeah.
Be prepared, because you're going to be on it.
Okay, sounds good.
So it's funny that you asked, like, is it about people? I'm pretty sure I asked Gavin Smith, and he was like, can I talk about that one time that Bob Kane got slapped or slapped somebody? And I was like, as long as we don't get sued, yes. But I'm very interested to know that story.
Oh, my God.
But my horror movie I want to talk about, which is how all of this got started, was actually Honeymoon. And there's 2 different movies called Honeymoon. This one is actually directed by Lee something. She's married to one of the Duffer brothers, but this came out before Stranger Things.
Okay.
And I'm not.
Is it werewolf related?
It is not. And it was not what I expected, and I also enjoyed it very much. So female directed, female lead, super great. There's only actually 10 people in the entire cast.
Wow.
Which, yeah, I was very surprised at. Really, it's done perfectly. Or I was going to say Vivarium, which also came out this year, with Jesse Eisenberg and something else. I'm into weird alien horror stuff.
Oh, okay.
This one was super bizarre, kind of like Twin Peaks vibe. And then my history, I would love to do the Stan Lee thing, but I don't know enough about him right now. As it stands, I would have to do a ton of research. So if I had to pick something I knew really well, it would probably be... I was going to say 30 Days of Night, because that was like the one comic I was obsessed with as a teen.
You should do it. No. It's in Alaska.
Definitely be a way better expert on it than I would.
I just love that it's like one of the few comics that exists in Alaska, and it mostly gets it right, kind of. The movie definitely didn't. The movie definitely did not get it right.
That's one of the other things is like, are people going to bring up movie adaptations? Because I hope so. I want people to angrily rant about them.
Yeah, that one is definitely a weird one. I mean, it is funny. Where 30 Days a Night takes place is Barrow, Alaska. I'm going to tell you a quick anecdote about my Barrow, Alaska experience. I went there once, and it was in December. I've lived in Alaska my entire life. I should know these things, but I go to rent a car for work because I'm up there for work. And I asked the guys, like, hey, when does it get light out? And the guy, like, looks at me for a second and just goes, March. And I was like,
oh, yeah.
Yeah, because it's like, it's not just 30 Days a Night. It's like 90 Days of Night.
Yeah, a couple months.
It is really wild.
I didn't know what portions of Alaska that entailed.
Very, very north.
Geography.
It's like the most northern part of Alaska that's actually still like a town/city. It is about, okay, this is a guess, but it's probably further north from me than New York is north from you.
Would you rather spend 30 days of night or 30 days of day?
Oh, I do both. Alaska during the summer is 30 days a day all the time. Like in where I live in Anchorage, it's not quite as intense as that. But on June 21st, so 10 days from now, it will get at most dim. Like it doesn't get dark. It just gets dim. And it's like that for like a week where it technically gets dark at about 4 a.m. or 3 a.m, but it doesn't really get dark. Like people
only for a week?
Something like that. It's just a stretch where it's just really, really light out. And then during the winter, it gets dark or it gets light out for like 4 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, it sucks.
Bizarre.
Yeah, it's weird because if I don't leave from work for lunch during that period, I literally do not see the sun.
I had a long conversation with Gab Contreras, who colors most of my work, about the sunlight and geography, location, and how it affects, because the 2 pages that I did for Insider Art, I specified morning and night and like what time of day that it was to like put in the panel. Mm-hmm. And she came back to me and was like, why does it get dark at 5 p.m.? Oh, sure. And I was like, oh, it's like dark here around 6 p.m. or whatever. It starts getting dark. And she's like, I don't understand that concept. The sun is blinding me constantly. Oh my God. And I was like, things that I take for granted, like being, regular. Where does she live? Yes. She lives in Peru. Oh, okay. Yeah, no. We normally when I tell people about what Alaska's like, they're completely perplexed by like everything. It's a weird place. A vacation there sounds stressful, knowing that you might not be able to sleep the entire time. See, that's one of the things that people are really surprised by is when they come up here during the summer, and it's just like normally Amber and I will be like, oh, let's go to bed at like 9 or 10 or whatever, because we're day people, or I'm day people. She's like somehow got into my world, and it's like it looks like 2 p.m. because that's just how Alaska is. It's really kind of weird. It can get... You just invest in those insane blackout... We do. Curtains. Yeah. It's like the only way to sleep. I do want to say your Stan Lee dreams could come true. Do you know who Abraham Reisman is? I can't place it. He writes about comics for Vulture. He actually has a biography about Stan Lee coming out in September, and he's been working on it for a long time. I haven't read it yet. He sent me a copy and I need to read it. But if you want to do your drunk history, you should read that and basically do like a promo. Oh, or you could get Abraham to come on and do a drunk history. Does he like drinking? Can you ask him for me? I'm sure. I'll ask him. I'll see if he wants. He can be your drunk history Stan Lee guest. That would be amazing. You will get an actual biographer of Stan Lee to come on. That is actually really perfect. That could be part of his promo thing. Oh my gosh. I would love to do that. It's incredible. Anyways, well, we could keep talking about podcasts and Stan Lee and everything else forever. But Liana, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about comics, art, and everything else. Thank you so much, dude. Big fan, longtime listener. Thanks for having me on. Before we go, I want to give a quick shout out to a very special patron, Sean Kirkham, with another edition of Off Panel's Beast of the Week. This segment is built to highlight someone or something in comics I've been impressed by recently, earning them the position as the podcast Beast of the Week. And for this 5th anniversary episode of Off Panel, I'm going to do something a little different, as the Beast of the Week isn't a single person, but a group. It's you, the listeners of Off Panel. I've been doing this for 5 years now, and it constantly astonishes me that people don't just listen to the podcast, but actually enjoy it. Getting to meet with you and talk with you over the years about what you get out of the show is an absolute thrill, and I appreciate each and every one of you who listens. I couldn't appreciate you more. You guys are all awesome. So thanks for that, and thanks for the support these past 5 years. So again, shouts to this episode's Beast of the Week, the listeners of Off Panel, and as per usual, Sean Kirkham himself, the ultimate beast.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer-artist Liana Kangas. You can find her on Twitter and Instagram at Liana Kangas, on her website at lianakangas.com, and her work in She Said Destroy from Vault Comics. As a heads up, Off Panel is once again brought to you by Sketch.com. Check out the new version of the site and consider subscribing for access to all the site's content and its members-only forum. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to weekly content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating and review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched, that's SKTCHD, follow it on Twitter at @SketchComic, or also on Instagram at @SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Dan Lee, Cameron Schrader, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Merrick, Christian Sheldon, Kenny Porter, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grumbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Harry Sayer, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Slates, Kill Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Troy Jeffrey Allen, Liana Kangas, Keegan Ray, Milton Lawson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Phil White, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Brawley, Ira James Udaskin, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Ching, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Greg Rucka, Adam Highfill, Fiona Staples, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.